want to tell you guys a little bit about a pretty large movement in the late 1940s, 1950s of people that really made a name for themselves by challenging the status quo and pushing counterculture in America almost more than anyone has in our history. And that's called the Beat Generation or the Beat Writers, the Beatniks. There's a lot of names for them, but they did a lot. And where it started was in Columbia University, New York, middle of New York, by five or six core guys. These five guys, really. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg is probably the two that you've heard of before. But William S. Burroughs, Herbert Hunk, and Lucien Carr are the other big names of this group of guys that created such a following of other young people, college-age kids, and within that, decade of people that didn't belong anywhere but wanted to belong somewhere. And many of these guys were antisocial, people that didn't belong, didn't identify, but they were writers and they were dang good at it. And they were able to publish some work and some things that people had never heard of or even thought of before. And it blew some people away, and it impressed others as well. And what it did was impress the young generation of America. Things you may have heard of these guys and then their work. The first really big one was Howl by Allen Ginsberg. It was obviously made into a movie, but it pushed homosexual behavior, and it pushed drug use and grotesque images and things that really, it scared some people, impressed some other people, but it got a name for themselves, and it made them popular, along with Jack Kerouac's book, On the Road. He traveled across the country, and in the process, he had created the Beat Generation. He coined the phrase, he coined the name, and he got his friends together when he came back from his road trip, wrote this book in the process, published it, went through a bunch of hoops to publish it, got it out there, and it spread like wildfire. And they became popular within a year and a half, something extremely quick. And they put all it was pushing nonconformity, pushing of just living their own life and not being told what they have to do. And that's usually, very things that were very, off-piste and very against the grain of America. And they created such a big following that they kind of took over Greenwich Village in New York, which is where Columbia University is. These guys all stayed there and hung out. And these followers, the young kids would come and they'd listen to people like Allen Ginsberg recite his poems in the park. If you were a young kid at that time, or anyone really going out in this area of New York, you'd see these writers all the time in cafes, in bars, restaurants, taking them over, hanging out, talking, listening, thinking fluff up, really, but just to talk and to get things going and talking in it. And a lot of times it would inspire each of them, and they'd feed off each other and go write some cool stuff and some poems and some music and books and things to get published, because that's really what they just love to do. And it really fueled this generation of kids that were under such strict policies by the older generation that were raising them. And that same older generation, they were not happy about it at all. Because these kids were rejecting materialism, they were combating racism, they were supporting anti-war efforts, they were pushing homosexuality, living these vagabond, nomad lifestyles, and they didn't go anywhere without a drink in their hand, a joint between their fingers, or a tab under their tongue, or something up their nose. And it was apparently a big problem, not necessarily a problem for them, but others saw it. The older generation saw it as a problem, and they wrote them off, and they wouldn't publish anything that they wanted them to, and they wouldn't let them do anything that they wanted to do. But they did it anyways, and they brought a lot of people along with them. A perfect example, microcosm of a beat writer's life, is Jack Kerouac, a writer that you may have heard of. He's kind of the face of the Beat Generation. He obviously coined the phrase, but this is the name that people are most familiar with. And his story is very interesting. After quitting the Columbia University football team, where he met his friends, and then lasting only 8 days in the Navy, he couldn't handle the social aspect of it. He couldn't handle the anyone telling him what to do, and he found his calling as a writer in the process. He had a lot of time in the service to figure out that he really enjoyed writing stuff down and getting it out there and telling people about stuff through his writing. And his writing was one way you could call it, but really consisted of just going on 2 or 3 week benders where all he would have was stimulants, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, lots of alcohol, and maybe an occasional sandwich. And he would string together hundreds of feet of typewriter paper and just start typing so he could avoid the reloading time of the paper. But I mean, it's impressive because I mean, you can't, edit anything. You just write, you just type away. And that was actually how he wrote on the road here, was doing that exact style of writing or whatever you want to call it under whatever substance that he was under. And he did a very dang good job of it because his followers loved it. Unfortunately, these substances that he abused so much, that fueled and was the genius behind his writing, or part of it at least, led to his death at age 47, very, very early and tragic. But what ended up happening was these beat writers got pushed out when they started to get so popular. They got pushed out of New York. They got pushed out of away from the college campuses because they were infiltrating all the kids that these older generation were sending to school and paying for their education. They got pushed out big time by the authorities and whatnot. So they went west, like a lot of people did, a lot of young people did in the late 1900s. They flocked to San Francisco, and they brought a lot of people along with them. And the very interesting thing about it is the drug LSD started to really hit the market, or they had been experimenting with it for years, but now it was out being mass produced, and sent into the population of people. So they moved to San Francisco. LSD sits on the market, and it's just a recipe for disaster. But what it created was people that could express their minds and expand their minds and think of things that you would never even thought of before. But it got people actually thinking, and it got some stuff going. And what happened was this natural friendship grew between the beat writers, and their anti-conformity, and other countercultural leaders and supporters like Neal Cassady, who drove around a bus with a bunch of people called the Band of Merry Pranksters, and they would go around making a name for themselves, protesting and demonstrating, and uprising against all the stuff that they didn't want to do that the rest of America was doing. And another one is Ken Kesey, who wrote one of Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I'm sure most of us has read. And that guy really liked his acid as well. In fact, he said he even wrote the book mostly on that drug. But it got his mind going in a way that worked for him, and same with a lot of these other people. And that combination with the beat writers' inspiration, and what they were writing about and what they were spreading, got it going, whether Jack Kerouac and them wanted to or not. It sure seemed like, based off of their work, that they did. And what that kind of blew up into was the hippie movement of the 1960s and even into the 70s. These people grew up reading Ginsberg and Kerouac, and they were friends with the people that were friends with them, and they really just got into it. They got going, but they didn't necessarily foster the same push against, passionate push against anti-conformity. They just kind of peace, love, and hey, we love everything that you guys are writing about. We identify with you, but the beat writers are more of a movement and like, let's get something going. Let's get people thinking. Let's get stuff talking. And the idea was, it ended up being introducing America, or conformed America, to the way out. And you hear "way out, bro." That's their saying, but at the same time, it's the way out of conformed life. Another very interesting group that these beat writers influenced are some of these guys that you guys probably recognize. It was a little bit more just peace and love. It was peace, love, and rock and roll. And the Beatles were really good friends with Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg, and William Burroughs, and they toured with them. And they were in sets with them, and hung out with them, and fed them ideas and fed them things, and showed them their works and read them their poems that they were passionate about. And Bob Dylan, Jim Morrison, all these guys, and many more actually, they vibed with that. They enjoyed that, and they even, you can see it in some of their music, and they've said, oh yeah, these guys, Jack I was hanging out with, he inspired that lyric right there, and I put it in my song, and millions of people are listening. So you combine that with these people and what music they're listening to, and the beat writers that influence the music, that influence the people, and you just have this we can call it a recipe for disaster, but what it was it got people thinking, and it started to filter through the rest of America. Now I've called these guys beatniks a couple times, but there's a really, really important distinction you need to make between beats and beatniks. Beats, which Jack Kerouac, coined, They were a group of passionate writers, and they desired the nonconform life. They spread their beat gospel. See, it's hard to know the distinction, but beatniks are the stereotypical. It's almost cartoonish because that was where it came from. The news outlets coined this beatnik phrase, and I mean you can see in these couple examples here that they were not big fans of these kids, and they were poisoning the minds of the youths of America and whatnot, and so they made a bad name for those people very quickly, which had a lot to do with why they got pushed out of New York so quickly. But really, if there's one thing for you to take from this and to remember about these guys, is the Beat generation, these beat writers, led one of the most successful free speech movements in American history. And they inspired decades of other young adults to rebel, feel like they were choosing their own path in life, and it filtered across an entire nation. And they were so influential. And really, I mean, you talk about going against the status quo, avant-garde. That was these guys, and I think they did a very good job of it. They were very successful, and they kept on writing and kept on going. And some of them are still alive today. You can see their work and the influence that it's had on many artists, many writers, many musicians throughout the history of our country, and even to some of these kids that were kids in the 50s following these guys. Now their grandkids are a little bit different because of this group of guys. So I'd say they did a very good job, and they made a pretty big difference. Thanks for listening.